gracious and loving God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you now and forever, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. One of the things that I love to do when I get a chance is to walk a labyrinth. For those of you who have never seen a labyrinth, here is a very traditional one that's an indoor labyrinth, although they can really be prepared anywhere. There are lawn labyrinths that you will see. People have rock labyrinths that they make. There are even labyrinths that you can hold in the palm of your hand and be able to trace with your finger. And the purpose of a labyrinth is about getting to the center. Because in the center is a place where you can truly center yourself and focus on God. And it looks a little bit like a maze, one that you might see in kind of those big jumbo activity books when you were a kid, right? And you had to find your way around, and you were always looking for the right path. Well, the wonderful thing about a labyrinth is that it's not set up or designed to be a maze, but it's one path in and one path out. So that when you step into the labyrinth and you begin to walk, as you can see here at the opening, as you wind around, you're never going to get lost. The path will always lead you into the center, and when you come back out, the path will always lead you back to where you began. And the wonderful thing about a labyrinth is that because you don't have to worry about finding your way, you can concentrate on whatever it is that's on your heart at the time, whatever it is that you need to bring before God. Those who have walked the labyrinth many times, the veterans, if you will call them, will say one of the best practices is to start with a mantra or a word that you will say over and over again, something that you can just focus, because this first part of the labyrinth walk is all about clearing your mind. Because we all come in with so much going on in our heads. We have family things, we have work things, we have church things, we have whatever it might be. But we have a lot of different things pulling for our attention, and often that will pull us away from concentrating on our relationship with God. So sometimes it may just be a simple word of help, or heal me, or save me, or I confess. Very simple things, but things to keep repeating over and over and over again until our head is cleared and we're able to hear more than we're speaking. And the first time I ever walked it, I was really unsure about how this was going to work. And as I got about a quarter of the way through, it really did start to clear my mind. And all of a sudden I began thinking about things a little bit more intently. I could focus on things more than I could when I first stepped in there. And the goal is that by the time you reach the center, your mind is at a point where you can truly sit and listen for that call of God that we talk about so much in the church. But how much more can we hear it when we've quieted our minds and our hearts and opened ourselves to God? Now, the other wonderful thing about a labyrinth is that there is no time limit on this. In fact, if you don't have a lot of time and you really need to get to a place of going to the center There's no even proper way to walk the labyrinth. If you want to, you can go right from there into the center. Now, may take away some of that opportunity to clear your mind, but the point is to be able to stay in that center as long as you need to, as long as you need to listen. And then on the path out, is to offer gratitude. To find something within that time of listening, within that time of praying, that helps you to leave that center place, giving God thanks for whatever it might be, for hearing that call more clearly, for seeing from a new perspective, for coming to an understanding of what's going on in your life, but to leave that center with a feeling of gratitude and response. Now, sometimes that can be a difficult thing, depending on what you've spent time in the center of the labyrinth asking God about. But it's also a freeing and wonderful thing. And I found that as I exit the labyrinth, just my whole body, my whole spirit has had a transformation. I come out breathing easier. I come out feeling almost lighter. And often I come out feeling more committed to what I've been commissioned to do through my calling. It is a spiritual practice. It is a spiritual discipline. And I wish I could do it more often. But the one thing about walking a labyrinth is what? You need a labyrinth, right? And they're not always easy to find. Some churches do have them in the area, but sometimes there are painted labyrinths that you can roll out on floors, and again, you can trace labyrinths. So it's still a practice that I could do more often than I do, but it takes discipline to be able to do those. Just like all of our spiritual practices and disciplines, whether they be prayer, whether they be going and immersing ourselves in the Word every day and reading the Bible, whether it be doing a daily devotional practice or whatever we might do, it takes commitment and it takes going over and over, because what it will do is focus and center us on God. Now, one spiritual discipline that we don't often think about is this one called stewardship. Stewardship and simplicity. Now, last week, when we started this sermon series, I threw a whole lot of information at you, and probably too much information at you, especially on a Memorial Day weekend. But I hope that you walked away from that first message understanding that stewardship is not often what it's made out to be. It's not a fundraising campaign. It's not all about money. But it is actually a way of life and an act of worship. Because it's giving everything we have, all that we've been given by God, and giving that back through our resources, through our time, through our gratitude. And stewardship is also a spiritual practice. It's a way for us to connect more deeply and more intimately with God. Now, Jesus teaches today this very important lesson. Because Jesus was so worried about where our heart was in relationship to God. And Jesus knew that our possessions, our material resources, Those things that we can come to put up on the pedestals and treasure could take our heart away from God and shift it onto those objects, which last week we defined and called what they truly are, which is idols. And so Jesus says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Now, it seems like an easy lesson. It seems pretty straightforward, pretty simple. But oftentimes, as preachers and as people who read this and have heard it many times, we sometimes can get it confused and we can actually turn it around. We can think that where your heart is, there your treasure will be. And I've heard sermons, and you've probably heard sermons. In fact, you've probably heard me preach a sermon where we've talked about, well, let's look at where we spend our money. And if we look at where we spend our money, then that's how we define what our values are. And that ultimately tells us where our heart is going to be. But that doesn't leave a whole lot of hope for us, does it? Because if we say, we look at our checkbook and we see that, we've spent this much on our cable, we've spent this much on our car, we've spent this much on our home, we've spent this much going out to eat, it kind of locks us in to say, well, we're not really ever going to be able to change. Because that's where we're spending our money. That's where we're locked into. But Jesus wants us to understand that, no, there is good news in this. There is hope that we, through the direction of our heart, through the choices we make of where to put our treasure, that is where our heart will end up. Where you put your treasure, that's where your heart will end up. Mark Powell, who wrote the book Giving to God, says this. He says, "The point isn't that how we spend our money reveals what sort of people we are, but that how we spend our money determines what sort of people we become." And that, I think, is an important distinction. Because I think we can all look back on our lives and say there are times where we have put our money and our material resources into things that truly aren't lasting. Those things that Jesus talks about being susceptible to the moths and to those who come in and steal. And we often put a lot of our time and energy into protecting those resources too, don't we? It's amazing how in just a few years, our home security systems have gone up triple what they were, say, 15 years ago. What we're spending on home security is almost 100% more than what we were spending 25 years ago. So we're spending this time and material to protect our resources, but we're also spending a lot of money to store those resources. The amount of extra storage space that we have rented and that we have things that aren't even in our homes that are taking up space in storage bins all across the country has exploded. And so we all come to that point where we say, where have we been putting our money? Where have we been putting our resources, our energy? And we can all come to a conclusion that we haven't been centering them on God. We've been centering them on ourselves. Our heart is where our treasure is at this point. But the good news is that we can make that change. we can reverse that back to the way it should be, because we can direct our hearts by directing our resources, our money, our time, our talents towards God. And the question we're left with today, and the challenge that we're left with today is, where is our heart? Where do we want our heart to be? It's not always easy to do a self-assessment of our stewardship, because stewardship is not always an easy thing to nail down. But if we're honest with ourselves, if we truly take a look at where our heart is today and where we want it to be, we can see the difference if we look to the past and see those times where we have been living the stewardship life and those times where we have not. And what's the feeling? What's the difference? I wrote about in this past newsletter article about a time when I was in the summer going into 7th grade. And we went on a mission trip, my church, to just outside of Boston. We were working with the Heifer Project model farm. And on that farm, they didn't have a cow, E-I-E-I-O. But on that farm, they taught people how to raise their animals in countries where they didn't have all of the amenities and the benefits that we have in this country. So they were sending cattle and water buffaloes and chickens to countries like Kenya and Uganda. But on this farm, they were teaching people how to take care of those animals so that they would live and thrive and continue to provide food, not only for them, but sometimes for their communities and their villages. And we went there, and we were going to work for a whole week. And when we first arrived, the reason that I was so psyched to be on this trip was because there was a promise that at the end of the week, we were going to Fenway Park in Boston. I was going to get to see a baseball game. I was going to get to see this historic, grand old park. And so my whole week kind of got focused in on going to this baseball game. And I had, I was in 7th grade, so I didn't have a lot of money. I had my allowance. I had a little bit of what Mom and Dad gave me to go on this trip, and I was saving this $10 because I knew that when I got to the ballpark, I was going to head to that souvenir stand, and I was going to get something to take home with me, a hat, a shirt, a mini baseball bat, whatever it was. I was going to grab something, and that was going to be my memento for that trip. And nothing was deterring me from this thought until the night before we were going to go to the game. It was our last night of work. We had worked all day on the farm, and we had grown very close to the camp staff and those who were helping to work and run the farm. And so we had a potluck dinner with them that night, and we all sat around the table. There were probably about 25 of us sitting around this table. And as happens during meal times like this, people began to share stories. And one of the camp staff began to talk very passionately about how he had seen what was happening with Heifer Project working firsthand in countries like Uganda and Nicaragua and Honduras. And so he began talking about how he saw one cow and 3 goats, I think it was, and about 5 chickens completely transform a family's life. From one where every day was wondering about whether they would have enough food to eat, to an abundance where they were actually able to share milk and eggs and other food with their family and their village and those around them. And then as we continued talking further, I heard him say that it costs $10 to get 5 chickens to a country like Uganda or Kenya, to help a family to begin to experience this type of abundant life. And darn it, if I didn't have a choice to make right there and then, right? I mean, sometimes we want to think these things are coincidence, but here I have $10 reserved for this memento, where I have a choice to take this $10 and put it into something living and that will provide life. And when I really thought about it, there just wasn't a choice. Because the memento was going to be a dead thing. It might bring back some good memories, but it was going to sit on that shelf, and more likely than not, when I started cleaning my room, after graduation, it was probably going to be one of the first things to get tossed. So no longer was it really a choice. Do I give something to something that is dead and dying, or do I give something that is going to provide life? And that day, I chose the stewardship life. I chose to give my $10 to Heifer Project International. And I just came out of that experience feeling so much better, because I knew that I had done what God called me to do with those resources. Now, sadly, I've had many other opportunities to choose the stewardship life and have chosen to support those dead and dying things rather than those living things. But I have a choice to be able to direct that into what God is calling and leading me to do. Just as we all have that choice to say, where is my heart and where do I want to direct what I have been blessed with to bless others? Well, how do we do that? One of the ways, we've talked about this many times. We talked about it last year when we read through Adam Hamilton's book, Enough. We talked about it earlier this year in How Do We Live Happier Lives? It starts with this idea of live simply. That there will come a time where we need to make those tough decisions about what we do with the materials and the resources we've been blessed with. And when we're living simply, we can live more generously. Because we have that abundance that we can then press down, that can be measured, that can be overflowed. And when we do that, we will receive the promise that is a biblical promise, the one we heard about in the Gospel of Luke today. That when we give, we will receive in abundance. And it's not a dollar for dollar match here, folks. We're not talking about when we choose to let that $10 go that we're going to get 10 or 20 back in return. But it's joys and blessings that come to us in ways that we will never really truly understand. For I think about that $10 that was given back in, what was that, 1987? Seems just like yesterday. But I think if I would have put that into that memento would be in the garbage heap somewhere. But that $10 that provided life to one family has now continued on for a generation and more. Now, it's certainly not just that $10, but it was a start, a beginning, something that can move perpetually forward. And that's what I believe that all of our stewardship will do, not only for those we give to, but for ourselves. That it is a life-giving, perpetual motion. Every time we give from our heart, we receive back life. And life in abundance. So where do we want our heart to be this day, this week, this life?